Chapter 6. Teacher, teacher, here comes Jesus, here comes Jesus. With these words, a little girl burst into the study of the principal of the Pool Girls' High School in Osaka, Japan. She was referring to Sundar Singh, who was walking outside on the school grounds. The incident did not take place until 1919, when Sundar, 30 years of age, was touring Japan on a preaching mission. Yet it highlights an important facet of Sundar's personality, which became apparent early in his ministry. The Japanese girl was not alone in noticing the semblance between master and servant. In what ways were they similar? To some extent it was a physical likeness, but more important, there was in Sundar's personality and lifestyle much that resembled Jesus Christ. His pale brown skin, bearded face, and simple clothing evoked a striking physical similarity which was underlined by his unassuming confidence. A close look at Sundar's life reveals further points that correspond with the life of Jesus. Both had denied themselves a home and the comfort and joy of family life. In his role as sadhu, Sundar had adopted the same manner of life as Jesus, that of the itinerant evangelist. As Jesus had preached the gospel to the people of Palestine using simple language and parables drawn from nature and the everyday lives of his listeners, so Sundar Singh preached to the Indians. Jesus needed solitude to pray and to commune with his Father. Likewise, periods of meditation were essential to Sundar, and the lonely hill of North India and Tibet gave him ample opportunity. Sundar did strive towards the imitation of Christ, and as we have seen, this classic of the spiritual life was a book to which he returned time and time again. St. Luke begins the 4th chapter of his Gospel with these words: "Full of the Holy Spirit, Jesus returned from the Jordan, and for 40 days was led up by the Spirit, up and down the wilderness, and tempted by the devil. All that time he had nothing to eat, and at the end of it, he was famished." New English Bible. As Sundar read and reread the Gospel narratives of our Lord's fasting in the wilderness, an idea took root in his mind. Jesus had entered the solitude to fast and pray as part of his preparation for his public ministry. Sundar regretted that he himself had not done the same. In 1913, 8 years after he had first put on his sadhu's robe, he determined to remedy this. Where should he go? Along the banks of the Ganges between Dehradun and Hardwar, the forestation is particularly dense. Only an occasional party of laborers cutting bamboo ever ventured far into the forest of Kajliban. For the purpose of a retreat, this area had obvious attractions. In January 1913, Sundar was in central India, and he proceeded northwards by train in the direction of Kajliban. The journey took him several days. He did not travel by a direct route, since he chose to stop at various points to preach and teach. It was whilst he made his way northwards that he met, in a railway carriage, a Roman Catholic doctor named Smith. The identity of this man remains a mystery. In some versions of the story, his name is given as Swift, nor is it clear whether he was a medical practitioner or whether he was a doctor in some other field of study. Sundar revealed his plan to fast for 40 days to Dr. Smith, who tried hard, yet unsuccessfully, to dissuade him. Before their ways parted, Dr. Smith insisted that Sundar should give him the names of 6 close friends. Presumably, Dr. Smith anticipated that Sundar would not survive the fast and that he would die. Had he waited until news of Sundar's disappearance had been circulated before he acted, his part in the story would be less puzzling. For on the 22nd of January, within hours of Dr. Smith's parting from Sundar, 6 telegrams were dispatched from Nimoda, a small railway station in central India. They were sent amongst others to Dr. Wary, Sundar's headmaster at Ludhiana, to Mr. Redman, his friend at Simla who had baptized him, and to Bishop Lefroy. They all bore the same brief message: Sundar Singh slept in Christ, and were signed Smith. The news spread that Sundar Singh was dead. His friends mourned. A memorial service was held at St. Thomas's Church, Simla. Obituary notices appeared in the newspapers. Plans to erect a memorial were set in motion. However, the sole evidence of Sundar's death was a cryptic telegram from an unknown man called Smith. No corpse had been found, and Sundar's friends must have hoped for some happier explanation of the telegrams. Meanwhile, Sundar, oblivious of the telegram's dispatch, continued his journey north and eventually reached Kajliban forest. He made his way into the dense undergrowth until he came to a clearing. Having placed a heap of 40 stones beside him, he planned to cast one aside each day until none remained. His fast began. In the world outside the forest, his friends grieved. Towards the end of February, Bishop Lefroy was surprised to receive a letter from Anfield from Sundar, dated 22nd of February. He told the bishop that he had undertaken the 40 days fast, but that his health had broken down and that he had collapsed from exhaustion and exposure. He had been saved by bamboo cutters who by chance had stumbled upon his forest hideaway, found him unconscious, and carried him to safety. Probably at the time Sundar wrote that letter, he believed he had fasted for 40 days, but it is apparent that the length of the fast was nearer 20 days. Sundar later realized that his first assertion that he had been in the Kajliban forest for the full 40 days was mistaken. He agreed that he must have been found comparatively soon after losing consciousness. There was a naivety in Sundar's makeup that would have assumed that because Jesus had fasted 40 days and because he sought to imitate Jesus, that he too would have been led by God to undergo an identical experience. Bishop Appasamy in his biography maps out the probable sequence of events. It is known for certain that Sundar preached at Indore on the 19th of January. Indore was some 400 miles from the Kajliban forest. From Sundar's own account, it appears that he visited other towns and villages on his way to Kajliban, so it is unlikely he reached his destination before the 26th or 27th of January. Meanwhile, he had met Dr. Smith and the telegrams had been sent. Sundar's letter to the bishop was dated the 22nd of February, 27 days later. This certainly rules out the possibility of a complete 40-day fast and indicates that it probably lasted about 3 weeks. The telegrams remain an unsolved mystery. Attempts to trace Dr. Smith were unsuccessful. It can only be assumed that he was so certain that Sundar intended to undertake the fast and equally certain that he would die in the attempt that he sent the telegrams as soon as he parted from Sundar. The latter was still traveling to Kajliban when his 6 friends received their telegrams. Had he delayed his fast a little longer, he might well have heard the rumors of his own death. As it was, he disappeared in the forest for 3 weeks, knowing nothing whatever of the turmoil and grief his absence was causing. Setting aside the question of when and for how long he fasted, of what further importance is this experience? Sundar's own words in A Collection of Incidents indicate both his motive for undertaking the fast and the benefits he derived from it. After several years of service, I felt guided to go into some forest where, free from any kind of interruption, I could have a 40 days fast and ask for blessing on past work and for power for the future. When I first commenced the fast, for several days I experienced great hardship. Afterwards, it was not at all difficult. But the blood dried up to such an extent that I altogether lost the power of sight and speech. I could hear nothing and by reason of weakness could not even turn myself. But certainly my intellectual powers were sharpened several times over, from which I gathered proof of the true fact that the soul is an entity that cannot cease to exist when the body dies but goes on living. In that condition I experienced the presence of God and the fullness of the Spirit, which cannot be expressed in words. In that condition, too, I had a vision of the Lord in a glorious form, from which I gained the conviction that now he would assuredly keep me alive to serve him for some time. Sundar further elaborated on his experience in the forest when in 1920 he visited Oxford. Bishop Appasamy, then a student, and Canon B.H. Streeter, an Oxford theologian, were gathering material for a book they wrote jointly called The Sadhu. It was a study of Sundar's spiritual life and was published in 1921. He recalled to them that his feeling of peace was so overpowering that he felt no temptation to abandon the fast, but immersed himself gladly in a tide of joy. Sundar was able to pinpoint unmistakable benefits that he attributed to the fast. He regarded it as an important stride along the road of his discipleship. First, they confirmed his belief that the peace and joy he experienced came from God, and were not due to some capacity of his own spirit. In other words, the spirit was different from the brain. The brain, he said, in an attempt to express this idea pictorially, is only the office where the spirit works. Secondly, from that time onwards, he felt better able to combat temptations to abandon his life as a sadhu with its continual hardships. Thirdly, he was less irritated after this experience by the questions he was continually subjected to from curious listeners. Although, as we have seen, the fast lasted considerably less than the planned 40 days, it is certain that he was in a very weak condition when the bamboo cutters found him, and that he only survived as a result of their timely intervention. They carried him out of the forest, and from there to the Christian community at Anfield. No doubt they decided to take him there after finding a copy of the New Testament by his side. At Anfield, he was taken to the home of the Reverend Dharamjit Singh. Unfortunately, Dharamjit Singh was away from home, but his adopted son Bansi agreed to take Sundar in and cared for him until the pastor returned. Bansi nursed him capably and fed him on liquids until his strength began to increase. It was 3 weeks before he was well enough to leave Anfield. His body bore the marks of the privations he had imposed upon it, yet he was full of plans to resume afresh his work for the master. On the 16th of March, 1913, he visited Thomas Riddle at Nahan, who noted in his diary, "Sundar Singh again arrived, now going to the Tibet border." Thomas Riddle recalled this visit in his articles on Sundar, and in July 1946 he recorded in the United Church Review that Sundar looked pale and worn. March, April, May, the snows began to melt and to swell the rivers, and for Sundar, Tibet beckoned again. His experiences in the Kajliban forest had confirmed him in his determination to serve his Lord and to tell others of his master's love for mankind. In Tibet, in the summer of 1913, Sundar was going to need all the spiritual resources he could muster. Preaching in Tibet had always been hard, had always been dangerous, but on this particular expedition everything seemed to be against him. The people were more hostile than ever, which meant food was harder to come by. His physique had not wholly recovered from the effects of the fast earlier in the year. Further demands through hunger, cold, and sheer physical exhaustion became his daily portion, yet he was undaunted. He would not turn back, as long as the weather permitted him to stay. Once the snows came, travel would be impossible, and he was determined to grasp every opportunity to proclaim his faith. Eventually he came to Rasar and began preaching in the marketplace. A small crowd gathered to listen and showed a cautious interest in his words. Sundar was encouraged to continue. Suddenly, the mood of the crowd changed. Some slipped quietly away. Others became belligerent, and Sundar had to face a torrent of abuse and threatening gestures. At first he was at a loss to understand the change in their manner. The reason soon became apparent. The people were being provoked by the servants of the Grand Lama. Once it was known that the Lama disapproved of the young man in the yellow robe, all interest in Sundar's preaching evaporated. To his dismay, Sundar saw monastery guards advancing across the marketplace towards him. Without ceremony he was arrested and dragged into the monastery and brought before the Grand Lama. Sundar knew that he could expect no mercy. It was forbidden to preach a foreign religion in Tibet, and the Grand Lama was obviously relishing his right to enforce the law. Sundar could offer no defense, nor did he wish to excuse himself or deny his message. His punishment was death. His captors did not intend to kill him outright. Such an act was against their Buddhist principles. However, they were prepared to punish their captives in a manner that would cause death, cruel though this was. Sundar was dragged outside to a dry well beyond the town. The lid was removed and Sundar was thrown in. He fell, many feet to the bottom. Above him the well cover was locked firmly into place, and the key, the only key, was returned to the Grand Lama. The fetid stench at the foot of the well was unbelievable, and although mercifully it was too dark to see, Sundar knew that he was surrounded by the rotting corpses of previous prisoners. He had fallen awkwardly, and the acute pain in his arm indicated that it had been broken. The situation seemed utterly lost. He felt that he could have faced almost any death rather than this slow torture. He prayed that God would save him, but he prayed more in faith than in hope. The putrid air, the lack of water and food, and the interminable darkness wore down his spirit hour by hour. 3 days passed. All Sundar now hoped for was the quick release of death, and for this he prepared. His prayers that night were interrupted by a grinding noise above. A key rasped in a lock. As he struggled to his feet, he could feel the fresh air blowing down the well. The lid had been opened, and in the moonlight he saw a rope swinging beside him. The end was tied in a loop. One of his arms was useless, and he was weak from lack of food. Mustering his strength, he placed one leg through the loop and clung on with his good arm as the rope was pulled up from the top. He felt his body being lifted over the rim of the well and laid gently on the ground. He lay there, weakly listening to the sound of the well cover being replaced. Every minute the fresh air restored him, and he raised himself a little to thank his rescuers. They had already gone. Sundar struggled to his feet and looked around. He was quite alone. In the early morning, Sundar, refreshed by a night's sleep, washed out his Sadhu's robe and laid it out to dry. He debated what to do. It was tempting to thank God for his deliverance and to leave Rasar as fast as possible. Yet, the more he pondered the situation, the more he felt that he would be wasting an opportunity if he crept out of the town unnoticed. What had God saved him for? By midday, Sundar was back in the marketplace preaching to a wide-eyed and incredulous crowd. The news that he had escaped from the well spread through the town and reached the ears of the Grand Lama. Once more, Sundar was arrested and brought before him. Someone in Rasar had rescued the Christian by stealing the key, and that person was a traitor. The Grand Lama was anxious to find him. Sundar was questioned closely, but he could not explain his rescue any more than the Lama could. How could anyone have stolen the key from the Lama's belt? Sundar did not know. The Lama fingered the keys at his waist. The interrogation ceased abruptly. The key to the well was still there. He stared at Sundar, the terror apparent in his eyes. "Get out of this place," he cried. "Never return here, lest the power that protects you should bring disaster upon us." The people cowered back in silence to let Sundar pass. He left Rasar, and no one tried to stop him. Rasar has never been identified on any map of Tibet. We have only Sundar's word for the story. His detractors maintain that he fabricated the incident. There is certainly no proof that it occurred. There is no proof that it didn't. There is, however, the unwavering conviction amongst his friends that he was an entirely honest man, and that such a deliberate lie would be so out of character as to make nonsense of his whole life. The beginning of 1913 had found Sundar preaching in central India just before his fast. His ministry, which had begun in the villages of North India, was being extended to other parts of the country. He was becoming a well-known figure. In general, among his fellow Christians, his name was mentioned in tones of respect and enthusiasm. Many appreciated the vision of the Christian life that he presented to India. Understandably, however, there were those who regarded him with mistrust, which frequently attaches to pioneers in any field. The fact that he sat lightly to the institutional church was resented. Others, with far less justification, were jealous of his abilities and sought opportunity to denigrate him. His vagueness and disregard for details of place and date, and his carefree and uninhibited retelling of his spiritual experiences, served to make him a sitting target for attack. Since he was not concerned with establishing his own reputation, he did not bother to defend himself. In 1913, these criticisms only amounted to murmurs. They were, however, to grow in volume, and were eventually to reach crescendo heights. In 1913, Sundar was still unperturbed. Opposition did not frighten him, and for him, 1913 stood out because it was the year of his fast, a milestone in his discipleship. Already he was reaping the benefits of this undertaking, for according to his friend Thomas Riddle, it was during this year that he began to have visionary experiences when he was praying. These he regarded as an unmerited gift from God, a bonus bestowed on some, yet withheld from others. He accepted these manifestations of God's grace with humility and gratitude, as outward and visible signs of a divine love, both enduring and boundless.